Greetings, friends. I'm Rob Hoyt, and thanks for joining me today on Dragon's Teeth, where, as you may have noticed, I've welcomed an esteemed guest, a gentleman who's been at the forefront of the UK wargaming scene for, well, a few years, shall we put it like that. It is, of course, the wonderful Mr. Henry Hyde. Hey, Henry, how you doing?
Well, Rob, thank you so much for having me on your show. And I feel very flattered you describing me as someone who's been at the forefront. Uh, I think anyone who's involved in any walk of life, really, not just our hobby, knows that you get little moments in the limelight, and it goes up and down. So at some point, on Twitter, suddenly you get thousands of followers and people are, oh, lovely. And then it's almost like you've disappeared from view and they're going like, who are you, mate? So I think I've been consistently somewhere in the hobby. I think that would be a good way of describing me.
Yeah, I mean, you've certainly been very active, right? And as we know from previous chats, you have a huge number of interests and talents, some of which coincide with my own. So we've always got plenty to chat about.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think I'll be right in saying you've been a magazine editor, you
yeah,
publish books, you're an author, you write war games rules, you're
yeah,
involved in design and painting figures. Uh,
yeah.
so many of the things that are attached to wargaming.
Yeah, I've just been I suppose you could say either lucky enough or stupid enough to turn my hobbies into what I do for a living.
Yeah.
And it was back in 2005. There'd been a magazine around that you might remember, Rob, called Practical Wargamer, that was
Ah,
run
yeah.
by, sadly now, the late Stuart Asquith. And Practical Wargamer had been one of my favorite magazines. It's just, how it is with any publication that if you find the right one, it just sort of speaks to you in your language. It's addressing your hobby in the way you understand it, and you feel like, oh yes, that's expressing what I would want to say. And there were certain writers who wrote for it, like Charles Grant,
Ah, right.
who
Yeah.
I I didn't revere him, but the Grant clan, starting with his father, the late Charles Grant, who wrote a book called The Wargame that was published in 1971. Um, that was kind of what I imprinted on as my hobby, and so that kind of voice he had, a kind of avuncular, friendly voice, was what I liked. I like to find that kind of war games writing,
Yeah.
and I think when that disappeared in the 90s, I was kind of like many people, kind of a bit bereft and thinking, oh gosh, well, surely someone's going to pick up this baton and run with it again. And no one did.
Right.
And it was in 2005. Who remembers Yahoo groups? Are they still going? Yahoo
I, you
online
know,
groups?
I think they still are because I did have a notification the other day about a Yahoo group. I was looking for something quite
Oh,
specific.
really?
Yeah. I couldn't
Well,
remember my Yahoo password, so I got
Well, there we
access.
go. There was a Yahoo group called Old School Wargaming, and I got invited to join this group, which was just nascent at the time, had a few dozen members who'd remembered I'd written an article that appeared in Miniature War Games back in 1986, I think it was,
Mm.
about fictitious wars. And they remembered that article, and to my enormous surprise, I discovered I'd got this secret little fan club, which
Oh,
I didn't know
brilliant.
anything about. We were saying,
Wow.
"Oh, that do you remember that article?" And so I joined the group and found myself in amongst kindred spirits, and the pressure group, discussions were, "Oh, what about practical wargaming?" And I realised it was just one of those things. Well, if I don't do something about replacing this magazine, no one's ever going to.
No one else will.
So
Yeah.
that was the end of 2005. I started Battle Games, and which was the name I'd given to a website I'd built and launched back in 1998, 18th
Ah,
of June 1998, because I was a web designer. I was one
right.
of the first web designers in the south of England,
Wow.
and Battle Games was almost like one of my practice websites, so I could go to potential clients and say, "Oh, look, I can build a website for you," and they were all going, "What's a website?
Yeah,
Why would
yeah,
I ever need a
yeah.
website?"
I know. Yeah.
So that's how Battle Games was launched, and then, as I say, the pressure grew, and I took the mad decision to actually launch a war games magazine, a bi-monthly war games magazine called Battle Games, back in 2006. And so that's what first turned my hobby into what I did for a living. And
Right.
anyone who's ever run a magazine
Oh,
knows,
yes.
yeah, you've been there, haven't you?
I have. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you were doing what, Tai Chi International,
Tai
weren't you?
Chi International. Yeah. Yeah. So
And
editor, writer, T-boy, do the design,
yes,
go and meet the printer, go and,
yeah,
yeah.
marketing guru, the whole shebang, right? Distribution. And it was just like, it took over my life.
Hmm.
And so, but it brought me for the first time to the public eye. And what a lot of the resistance I saw, when I was first launching the magazine, they're literally on forums back then. People were going, "Who are you? Why would I buy your magazine?"
Really?
There was a kind of aggression, yeah, because people get entrenched. There was the miniature war games crowd, and there was the War Games Illustrated crowd, and there was the War Games Soldiers and Strategy crowd. And
Mm.
so I was the new kid on the block, right? And but I was lucky because my skill set, because by profession I'm a graphic designer and
Yeah.
copywriter. So I had the skill set and the experience with the print trade and that kind of stuff to know what I was doing. And I think it took people by surprise that I actually went ahead and did it. And then they
Right.
went, it's not bad, is it? Right?
Grudging respect.
Absolutely. So that's kind of how it started, Rob, with the Battle Games magazine. So then what I've done subsequently, a lot of it has, fed on the experience I gained back then. So that was 2006. I launched it. I carried on owning the magazine till 2011 when stuff happened. The other titles suddenly got huge cash injections from various investors they managed to get. So
Right.
little old me struggling to get onto the shelves of, WH Smiths and places like that.
Yeah.
I had to own up to the subscribers and say, look, do you know what? I think I'm going to go bankrupt tomorrow, pretty
Wow.
much.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I was incredibly fortunate, Rob, and it taught me a lot about some of the people in the hobby. The
Mm.
offers of help I got were extraordinary,
Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
including from the editors of other magazines.
Oh, that is good. That's
And in
nice.
fact, it was the editor of Miniature War Games at the time, who basically went to his boss and said, look, this guy's respected in the hobby. He knows what he's talking about. Is there anything we can do for him? And basically, they turned around and said, well, we'll buy Battle Games off you. We'll buy the title off you, but
Ah,
keep you on as editor.
right.
So that was back in November, December 2011. And then, to my enormous surprise, in come 2013, the boss of this company, Atlantic Publishers, said, "Oh, look, Henry, we love what you do design-wise. It's coming up to a big anniversary for Miniature War Games. I think it was the 30-year anniversary or something. We'd like you to redesign the magazine for us." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you very much. Oh, yeah, I'll do that as a job." And they liked it so much, and the boss, called me to another meeting. He said, "Oh, look, we've had another thing. What we'd like to do is actually combine Battle Games and Miniature War Games,
Ah, right.
and have you as the editor of the new combined monthly title."
Very nice.
So I went from a bi-monthly editor to a monthly editor,
That's it doubles the workload at least,
also doing
right?
all the design stuff.
Also doing all the design.
And that was just like probably the peak moment for me, because the new Miniature War Games with Battle Games went down a storm with the readers.
Yeah.
And then what happened was about 2015, the boss suddenly announced that he'd sold the magazine to another much bigger company called Warner's, who do loads of hobby titles.
All right. Right. Yeah. I know. Yeah. Yeah.
And so suddenly, literally overnight, I had a new boss, a new company. I didn't know what was going on. And then they had a change of personnel there. In 2016, it just got too much. They wanted to do some things with the magazine that I didn't agree with.
Ah, right. Right.
So basically, I said, "Do you know what? I've had enough." So
Yeah.
since then, I've been doing the Patreon thing. You know about Patreon.
Yes.
recently, I had already written a couple of traditionally published books, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit.
Yeah.
But then about a year ago, 18 months ago, so I started properly self-publishing,
Yeah.
which is almost kind of going full circle, Rob, because of course we didn't call it that at the time, but of course I self-published my own magazine.
Well,
Right?
exactly. I mean, again, that's something we've got in common. And I mean, even going back before that, back in the real old days, we were putting out a fanzine and all
Yeah,
that sort of stuff. And for me, that's where that whole punk ethic came into that. If no one
yeah,
else is going to do it, then we'll do it.
yeah,
And I think it's great now that technology is such that self-publishing is available to anyone and
yeah.
everyone. And there's much less stigma now attached to it, I find as well.
Yeah, because I'm actually a member of an organization called the Alliance of Independent Authors.
Right.
And it's been going quite a while now, probably a decade or so. Um, the Alliance of Independent Authors was set up because obviously in the early days of self-publishing, a lot of people self-published an awful lot of rubbish, right? I mean, let's face it, some of it was just garbage
Yeah.
and they didn't bother to get any editing or proofreading
Oh,
done.
yes, yes.
Cover designs were just like, what
Layout,
the?
font size all over the
Oh,
place. Yeah,
man. Just,
yeah.
I think back to when I was, in the early days of the internet and web design, where people, I can have flashing lights there and
Oh,
I
I
can have the
know.
background color change while you're reading it. And we were sitting there going, no, you're making me blind.
I can have a yellow font on a black background and
Yeah,
all
yeah,
that sort
yeah.
of stuff.
Or even worse, I can have a yellow font on a lime green background, right? And all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of was echoed in the early days of self-publishing, where I've got Photoshop and I've got InDesign. I can
Yeah,
look at all
yeah,
this. And so the Alliance of Independent Authors came along and said, look, actually, there are some of us who either have been traditionally published or at least respect the standards set by traditional publishing, where you have a nice cover design, where you have high print quality, where the design and layout means it's easy to read, and
exactly.
so on and so forth.
Yeah,
And so I joined that ages ago, and it's a very mature organization now. And that's kind of um, certainly helped in the development of the self-publishing world. It's helped people to realize that, we really should be trying to achieve the same standards as traditional publishers. And I'll use this advisedly, used to achieve. Because, of course, what's happened is a lot of traditional publishers have cut staff and are cutting corners and
oh yeah,
actually aren't providing the same standard that they used to, and including particularly things
yeah.
like marketing. Now, when I did my last book for Pen and Sword, they sent me a sheet saying, look, basically, mate, you're going to have to do all your own marketing.
Really?
And so, give us a list of the people you know. What websites do you think you have a reach into, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
almost becomes a criteria now for being accepted
For
by
getting accepted. Yeah,
a
yeah.
traditional publisher, that they think, well, if you're a nobody, sorry, mate, we're not interested.
And
If you've
and
been on the
and
telly, right?
right, then you it's almost instant. It's almost
Exactly.
guaranteed
If you've
kind of
eaten
thing.
cockroaches in the jungle, we're listening, right?
I mean, that's mirrored across the music industry and everything else now,
Yeah,
right? But
yeah,
it's that double-edged sword. We've got the technology to do it ourselves, but then we have to do everything ourselves, it
yes,
seems.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Now, it was one of your books specifically, or the subject of the book I wanted to talk about today. And there's 1,000 things we could talk
Absolutely. Yeah.
about. um, I recently started a campaign using the Fantastic Battles fantasy rule set in
Yep.
10 mil. For anyone who's looking for a real good set of mass fantasy battle rules, then that's certainly the best we've found. We really enjoy using them. And I'm someone who enjoys playing one-off battles, but
Mm.
I always like to link those things together as well. So, as regular viewers of the channel will know, I've set up this campaign called Bane Wars. We've got 5 players involved. We're on about turn 15 at the moment, and
Well,
there's all sorts of hijinks going on. There's been very few face-to-face battles yet, but there's a lot of espionage and backstabbing and all that stuff,
Fantastic.
which to me is what gives the campaign atmosphere, right? Now,
Yeah.
you, of course, have a very well-known book called Wargaming Campaigns. So
Yeah.
I
A
thought,
slim volume, a slim volume.
it's we talk about fitness and health. Well, there's a good one for your weight training, right?
Yeah. Shall I go on? Let's
Yes,
feel the heft.
Yeah, look
That's
at
the
that.
one. And yeah, folks, if you haven't seen it in the flesh, it's, what is it? What are you? 526 pages, I think it is, plus end papers. So, couple of kilos for
Nice,
sure.
nice, but a nice, a nice weighty tome. That's what you want, and it's
Heft.
comprehensive, right?
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, yeah.
So, what I wanted to ask you first of all is,
Yeah.
what's your definition of a war games campaign? How would you define it?
What's my definition? Okay, start with the tough questions. I suppose the way I would define a campaign is essentially it's a way of making sense of in a war games context. I think it's a way of making sense of the games that you play on the tabletop, the individual games you play on the tabletop,
Right.
so that they are interrelated in one form or another. Now, obviously, in historical terms, you would think of a campaign in terms of, okay, think of Normandy 1944, the Normandy campaign, which begins with the D-Day landings on the 6th of June and moves through to the point where they kicked the Germans basically out of that part of France, and we're moving into the Low Countries and moving towards the borders of Germany.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, a common interpretation of a campaign is in geographical terms, isn't it? Where you say, okay, we're starting at point A and our goal is to reach point B. And often our goal is to reach point B by date X.
Right, there'll be a time
And
limit on it. Yeah.
exactly. And in certain periods of history, that ties in nicely as well, because certainly in the pre-modern era, fighting in bad weather was just a no-go.
Yeah.
So right from ancient times through to the kind of end of what you and I would describe as the horse and musket era. So let's say the end of the 19th century or thereabouts, late 19th century. So much is determined by what the weather will allow you to do. And so during the winter, it's just too cold. The ground is rock hard, particularly in the days before mechanization. Of course, armies were reliant on horses or camels even to get from place to place. And if there's nothing there for them to eat, that means you've got to carry it all with you. So then that brings in other things like logistics, where you have a logistical tail, as it's known, of wagons carrying fodder just for the horses who are pulling the wagons full of the food and drink for the men, right? And I once did a calculation a few years ago now about just how many wagons it took to transport a single division of troops around, and it's thousands and thousands of wagons. And of course then you get all the complication of, do you set up supply dumps along the route? Famous examples from history would be the Duke of Marlborough and his march to the Danube in the Blenheim campaign, where he'd thought ahead, months ahead, and set up fortifications and supply dumps along the route for his army, so that every so often they could stop and even get new shoes, new boots, right? Because he would realize that, because the quality of shoes they will have worn out after 100 miles or 200 miles or whatever it was. So they're going to need new shoes. Now, things like that are like, wow, that's so basic. But this is also where you can see how a campaign can start to get mired in detail, in the minutiae, right? And so how you define a campaign, to a certain extent, is also down to the players. because you've got if you like a historical definition. Oh, it's a connected set of battles, that each of which has an effect upon the other. But also you've got all the other stuff that goes with that, and you have to ask yourself, okay, oh right, because you do get. I'm one of those sad people. Oh, I love working out how many wagons it would take and how fast they would move and how many horses each. And so that needs 8 horses on that wagon, but they're going to need another 4-horse wagon to carry their fodder, and they're going to need 2. It can just go crazy. Now, I'm happy to do that, and someone who's a solo wargamer, of course, has got all the time in the world.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But you're obviously familiar with the fact that there are other. If you're getting a group of people together, so let's do a war games campaign. Let's say you've got 8 or 10 players, right? And you ask each of them, so what do you want this campaign to be like? You're going to get 8 or 10 different answers.
Yes.
You're going to get one guy who says, a series of battles, love it. I so long as you just tell me, how many troops to put on the table that day and what state they're in, I'm all for it.
Exactly.
And then you get another guy who says, because I've had this in campaigns I've run, where he says, effectively, I'm a senior civil servant, so I am going to go, right, well, we're collecting this amount of taxes, and what revenue have I got available for that, Henry? And what trading routes might this affect? And
brilliant.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Most players, I suppose, are somewhere in between. They say, "Oh, well, I quite like doing map movement, so I can feel like I'm doing a bit of strategy as well as the tactics." Right. So your simple sounding question of how would I define a campaign? Of course, the only answer I can give, Rob, is it depends. Right. There's what I would happily define as a campaign involving all that other guff, and Lord knows, one of the books behind me there is all about the highly detailed stuff I wrote for, one campaign, the Martinstadt 1744 book. And that has a niche market, I'm delighted to say, because that was a risk. I said, no one's going to be interested in this. And to my surprise, quite a few people.
Well, you never know.
Even if only to go, Henry, he's mad, right? But it depends, because the last thing you want when you're running a war games campaign, isn't it, that you've got some players who are going, wow, this is great, and sending in your orders, and then there's other players where you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, the deadline for getting their orders has passed.
Yeah.
Do I chase them? Are they busy? Are they ever going to get involved?
Well, I've had that exact experience with the current campaign, where all of the players are thoroughly engaged in it, except for one guy who I think he had a different view of what the campaign was going to be. So it's coming round now. So we're getting that now. But the interesting thing on my part is then I was able to weave that into the narrative and just have this army who's sort of wandering around going, what are we doing? Why are we here? So there's a way to sort of turn it around sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm going to get on to difficult players in a moment as well, because there's a very old campaign I run was a Napoleonic naval one, and there was a particular incident with that it actually put me off running campaigns for a while, but we'll get to that. So the other thing I wanted to ask then is, what made you write the book? Did you have all this information and numbers in your head and you just had to get it out on paper?
Sort of, but not really. I mean, the other book that's over my shoulder there, the Wargaming Compendium, which was the first one published in 2013. There was a chapter in that all about campaigns. And so realistically, what happened was, in between time, because that was 2013, this was published 2022. Lots happened in that interval, I can tell you. But lots of people just said, oh, Henry, tell us more about campaigns. Oh, right. Simple as that.
Nice.
And I also had published some other stuff. I've got a long-running imaginary fictitious countries campaign that's been going for donkey's years, called The Wars of the Faustinian Succession. And I'd written about that in my Battle Games magazine, and I'd written about it in the compendium, and I'd published a couple of bits just in PDF format on my PayHip site. and they've got quite a lot of interest. And it also, talking to the publisher at the time, this was early on because I got contracted to write the second book not long after I was doing the first book. And it was like, oh, right, well, the campaigns, yes. And I was saying, God, there's so much I could write about campaigns, but obviously couldn't fit it all into the compendium, which was already 520 pages. And in fact, I'd started the chapter about campaigns. I had to axe about half of it because it was like becoming a book in itself already when I was writing the first book. So it just seemed logical, right? Okay, let's write a separate book about campaigns. And then it's like, okay, I started doing a load of research to find every example I could at the time of, right, well, not just my campaigns, what have other people done campaigns wise? And of course, there was famous books written by particularly Tony Barth back in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Setting up a Wargames campaign. Don Featherstone's book about Wargame campaigns. Charles Grant had written about campaigns, and there were even a few commercial rule sets for campaigns. And of course, then when you're talking about campaigns, this becomes an interesting crossover point because, of course, a lot of board games have, been written for campaigns more than just individual battles.
Rather than just your battles, yeah.
Exactly. So there's a lot of kind of hex and counter games and even things like Kingmaker and what have you that you can see in a campaign context. So that was like, oh, okay, I've got some reading to do because I didn't, I'm not so much of an egotist, Rob, that I think, hey, I'm a famous author. I'm just going to write my book about campaigns and everyone can do what I say because, wargamers and what they would say to that. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity not just to write down what, my own ideas about campaigns, but hey, why don't I collect under one set of covers as much as I possibly can, showing what other people, So it becomes, if you like, a book that's almost like a toolbox. Someone's described it as a toolbox book.
Oh, right.
As much as kind of anything, more than anything prescripted. This isn't the tablets of stone, on the mountain.
Yeah.
This is a collection of ideas that you can read through and pick and choose as and when you see fit. But then also, your first question about how do you define a campaign? Suddenly it was like, oh, yeah, what about naval warfare campaigns? What about air warfare campaigns? What about fantasy campaigns? What about sci-fi campaigns?
Yeah.
Right?
It just goes on and on and on.
Right? Absolutely. So it's like, oh, well, the book ended up taking me 9 years to put together, mate. So
9 years.
Yeah. Wow. There was a slight case of, there was in the middle of that, there was cancer, COVID, and a mental breakdown. But let's not worry about those things.
Well.
So there was a number of things put the brakes on at various times. But overall, the research and writing and compiling it took me 9 years.
My word.
One of the big sections in there was one of the big questions I've always been asked is, if I had £1 for every time I heard this. Is there a bit of software you use to do your maps, Henry? Right? Well, yeah, there is, and it's called Adobe Photoshop, mate. And yeah, it's not like just press a button, it'll come up with a map. Ironically, since writing the book, there has been software appeared online, and now with artificial intelligence, that effectively you can just say, I want a mountainous country with a coastline.
Yeah,
bang, there you go.
Yeah.
So that'll have to be a second edition. But this is the other thing. When you write a book, even when I was writing the compendium, when you're writing a book about our hobby, it's only ever a snapshot in time. And I covered an awful lot in the campaigns book. But even, as I say, just that example, since I wrote the book, since it was published 2022, already, artificial intelligence suddenly is like,
so that's changed the game again in terms of, you say, map generation, plot generation, country generation, all this kind of stuff.
All that kind of stuff. You could go into Chat GPT now and type in, the art of artificial intelligence is in terms of the prompts you give it, isn't it? But you can go in and say, oh, yeah, right, invent a country for me that's sort of Middle European in flavor. They all speak German. It needs to have about 1 million inhabitants. So describe the country to me and what its politics is like and blah, blah, blah. Bang. You
You've
know, a
got it.
couple of minutes later, whack.
Yeah.
Now, it's up to you how you feel about that, but it's an option now that wasn't there when I wrote the book.
Sure.
But certainly, Rob, you know, the compiling the book took a long time, but I think by the end of it, I feel content that I put in as everything I could think of at the time.
Right.
I
Right.
covered as many bases as I could, and I'm really pleased to see that there are people out there even making YouTube videos using my book, referring to my book,
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I've watched some of
right?
those. Yeah. Yeah.
Where it's like, blimey, you know, for an author, that's a slightly weird and unique experience where someone's literally creating a map or campaign of their own and flipping backwards and forwards, you know, through the book you wrote and using the tables and charts, and that's amazing.
But this is the lovely thing with the hobby and in terms of books, because I think when we chatted before, you know, we both started about the same time, and we had the
Yeah,
Terence Wise book, and you mentioned Charles Grant and Donald
yeah,
Featherston. Uh, and to some extent, they still hold up. I mean, some of the
yeah,
rules maybe need a bit of tweaking, but the nuts and bolts of it, the mechanics are the same. We're laying out a table, we're putting figures on it, we've got movement rates and all this kind of stuff going on. So something that's written, it's there for forever, basically,
yeah,
and you
yeah,
never know who you're going to influence later on, do you?
yeah, exactly. I think that's the thing, that I've written two enormous books now and a couple of smaller ones. Um, and yeah, I'm thinking of you know, a quote that's just popped into my head again. I feel the hand of history upon me, you know. But it's true that people have referred to my books as the Bibles of wargaming,
Well, that's very nice. That's a
which
lovely
is,
accolade, isn't it? That.
well, it's staggering. I mean, it's complete, you know, because I used to suffer terribly from imposter syndrome. Now,
Oh, we all
not so
do.
much.
We
You
all
know,
do.
I don't
Yeah.
suffer from it as much now because I realized, do you know what? I really did sit down and write and design and lay out and
Yeah.
publicized two of the biggest books that have ever been written about a hobby.
Yeah.
So I must be doing something right. And they both hit bestseller. You know, let's not get carried away. You know, I'm not J.K. Rowling here, but in our tiny niche hobby, they hit bestseller status on Amazon. You know, that little orange
Well,
tag
that's
means a
something.
lot.
That's quite
Yeah.
an achievement.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking, you know, hundreds rather than tens of thousands of copies, but, you know,
But still,
I'll take that. I'll take
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there is that. I don't know, that just that sense that, okay, all right, Henry, you've done all right, chum. You know, you've done all right,
Yeah.
and people have got my books on their shelves in the same way as I've got. You know, I've got a shelf just up here, which I'm going to, viewers, I'm going to turn the camera slightly. I don't know if you can see.
There we
This
go.
is my old school
Oh,
wargaming. So it's got all the Featherstone books, the Grant books,
oh,
the
lovely.
Asquith books, and that's sitting next to me there, Bruce Quarry and others, you know. So people have got my book sitting alongside those kind of titles in their home, which to me
Yeah.
is like, wow, that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
It's a lovely thing. As you know, I've published some books on martial arts, and I remember the first time I was invited to go and do some workshops in France, and I met the guy, went to his house, and there's my books on his bookshelf,
Wow.
alongside books about Bruce Lee and Robert
Wow.
Smith, and yeah, it's nice, isn't it? It's a nice
Yeah.
feeling.
It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. So yes, I think that in terms of the campaign book, I mean, it's comprehensive. I think you use that word, comprehensive. And I also, the thing I was determined to do was acknowledge the influence of the elders of the hobby, you know, the Grants and so forth, um, and bring in stuff written by other wargamers as well who contributed stuff. Um, and in fact, there's a story. Excuse me. I can tell about. I Unlike the compendium, I decided that because this was such a huge book, it'd take me such a long time together. Before I sent it off to the publishers, I assembled a team of beta readers. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So there was about a dozen of them who had said, "Yeah, I'll read it for you and give feedback." And obviously for an author, that's terrifying, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What if they hate it?
It's a scary feeling, right?
But in the end, it was the best thing I could possibly have done, because not only did they all say they liked it, but where they did make points, they were all really valid points.
Oh,
Like, oh,
that's
Henry,
useful.
I think you missed out this, or you've repeated that, or lots of quite detailed stuff. And something really fundamentally big. There's one of my beta readers, bless his heart, was Nick Skinner, Two Fat Lardies,
Oh,
Nick
right, yeah,
Skinner.
yeah, yeah.
Lovely guy. And he came back to me, said, Henry, I think you've missed, there's something you've forgotten to send me. And I said, is there? He said, yeah, the chapter on air warfare, air campaigns. And I went,
Uh-oh.
oh my God.
Uh-oh.
Sometimes when you're editing, you probably had this experience where you're so focused on the detail of this and that, and you miss the typo in the headline, right?
Oh.
And in this case, it was like, I'm sure I wrote a thing about air warfare and the air campaign. And to my horror, looking back at my manuscript, it's like, no, Henry, you included naval warfare, but air power, I'd completely forgotten.
Just missed
So
it.
right at the last minute, it was like, oh, yeah, right. And I had to sit down and put together a whole chapter about air power, which I think actually turned out to be one of the better chapters in the book. But thank bless Nick, I will be grateful to Nick for the rest of time, because that would have been such a howler, wouldn't it, if it had gone public? Because the publishers, Pen and Sword, they're like, we don't know wargaming, whatever.
Oh, yeah, they're going to flick through it. Yeah, there we go.
Exactly.
That's fine. Right.
They're checking for typos and that kind of stuff, and have I broken any legal, copyright issues or anything like that? But if they would have missed the fact that there was nothing about. I mean, things like hello, the Battle of Britain, the Vietnam War, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So yeah, that's a chapter that got shoved in at the last minute, and thank goodness I did. Yeah.
Well, I think that's an important lesson to all self-published authors, is get as many people as you can to check your work. And even then, I mean, I have 3 or 4 people proofread my stuff normally. Even then, you get the final print copy back and you open it up, page 6, page 7, boom, with 2 E's or whatever it is. And I don't know. I did do some copywriting. I actually worked for a marketing company many years ago. And one of the old boys there, he gave me the advice of, when you're proofreading, read backwards. Start at the end and work backwards, which I found interesting, because our mind sees what it expects to see sometimes. It is quite a difficult one, because when I proofread, I'm also checking the story, the plot points, that sort of thing. So you don't get that experience, but that is quite a useful one.
Absolutely. And a little total aside, if you're doing a painting and you're struggling with it, hold it up and look at it in a mirror.
Oh,
because then you'll see what's the same composition, but giving the balance in the opposite direction. And you often immediately spot, oh, yeah, that the composition needs something there or whatever. Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. I was going to ask you about your painting later on. And another talent, another string to your bows.
Another burden.
More time to spend. What advice would you give? I mean, again, we've touched on some of this already. We could go into a lot of detail, but what basic advice would you give to someone who's interested in setting up a campaign? The first thing, obviously, being, what do the players want? I guess, what sort of thing are they looking for?
The obvious piece of advice is start small. Don't. I mean, I'm mad, so I way back. The story of how I started my campaign is almost like an object lesson on how not to do it. I did a year abroad when I was at university. I was in Augsburg in Bavaria in Germany for a year, doing my history degree. And I kind of got lonely and it was a really cold winter that winter. It was like minus 30 or something stupid. And I was locked into this. Oh my, so many stories to tell about that we haven't got time for. But I was in an apartment. The landlord was an ex-SS Sturmbannführer.
Oh my word.
He showed off his tattoos that he had under his arm.
Oh wow.
But he was very, I'm so sorry I killed so many Tommies at Arnhem. That was his story. Yes. Yeah. I'm not kidding. Weird atmosphere. But anyway, there I was in my holed up in my little bedroom in Augsburg, and I had I got a pad of paper and some colored pencils or something, and I just had memories. I hadn't got a copy with me, but I had memories then of Charles Grant's The Wargame, when he had invented two countries. One was called Die Vereinigte Freie Städte, the United Free States, and the other one was the Grand Duchy of Lorraine. And he'd set his battles and little campaigns using these completely fictitious countries, one of which obviously represented sort of France in the 18th century or Austria, and the other one represented sort of Prussia in the 7 Years' War. And I just, oh yes, I could do that, and there I was sitting in Germany, with reference material all around me in a German, university library. And my imagination started running. And so I invented my fictitious countries of Prunkland and Faltenland, who are two Germanic countries that were more like kind of Prussia and Austria.
Yeah.
And just started fleshing them out. And I never stopped. I think that's the thing. And now I have several continents on the go, vast land masses. In fact, in the campaigns book, I chart the progress of how I invented my first sort of big colonial country, Dalia and Chindrastan, where I almost kind of made a mistake on the scale of the map, and this thing has ended up like thousands of miles deep and a couple of thousand miles wide. It's just ludicrous, vast continent. You could say it has lots of potential, probably potential that will never be fulfilled in my lifetime, but never mind. And the thing is, it's grown like Topsy. And so what's difficult for me, and for anyone who does something as daft as that, is it becomes difficult to focus in on something in particular.
Sure.
But so I would say, start relatively small. Start with, if you're going to create a map or use a map, start with something where even, one of the examples I give in the book is start with two neighboring, barons or lords in the medieval era, something like that, who are no more than, let's say, 20 miles apart, 15 or 20 miles apart, with the surrounding countryside. And they have got a relatively small retinue of men that amounts to probably a few hundred aside of men, rather than thousands, let alone tens of thousands.
Sure.
And practice with that first. And it's also a lot of fun just having these two, warring barons who are grabbing land and, trying to achieve, favor with the king or whatever it happens to be. It could be a lot of fun, and you could do really daft things like making a grab for each other's cattle or sheep, or, kidnapping a princess, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that can apply either to a historical setting or, of course, to, fantasy, sci-fi, exactly the same. Excuse me. Then, if you're in a later period of history, something again that I think, anyone who knows Bernard Cornwell's Sharp novels or watched the Sharp TV series, that's actually a brilliant example of how to scale up a campaign, because obviously Richard Sharp gets gradually promoted and in command of more men and sent off on increasingly daft missions. So the end one where they're trying to claim he had an influence on the Battle of Waterloo, that was a cringeworthy episode, but never mind. But the books are actually better than the TV series in that respect.
Yeah.
So, and that, of course, is, you think of a company like Two Fat Lardies, where they've got their game Sharp practice and they have their campaign system that allows you to do that, get promoted. And that, of course, tallies in with the kind of thing you often do in video games, where you achieve and get to the next level, or in Dungeons and Dragons, or any kind of role play game, where you achieve certain things, get to the next level, you have more powers, you have more influence, and so you're learning at the appropriate level. And it's a classic management thing, isn't it? If you're suddenly, if you start on the shop floor and suddenly someone comes down and says, "Oh, right, we've decided to make you managing director," you're like, what?
You wouldn't know where to start, would you?
Exactly.
You're
So it's the same thing when devising your wargaming campaigns. Kind of start modestly, and then if you find that I'm quite, I'm in control of this, the players are enjoying it, and if the players are saying, could we stretch your arms a bit more?
Sure.
Well, that's a good time to say, oh, all right, let's do that. Another thing that can help is by keeping the objective of the games quite finite, in time scale or scale. And in fact, over I think 5 or 6 times, I've lost track how many it was. For my campaigns, I got involved with some guys on a forum, the WD3 forum, and they got interested in my Wars of the Faltenian Succession, and said, "Oh, Henry, can we, chip in and put together a little campaign that we can take part in that culminates in a big weekend of games at this place called Ayton up in Yorkshire, near Scarborough." And so it was kind of backwards in a sense, where what we wanted for the weekend, which was a Saturday and Sunday, right, on the Saturday there would be 2 smaller games, still substantial by most people's standards, 2 smaller games, but then culminating in one enormous game on the Sunday. So that was a real challenge as kind of umpire, campaign coordinator, which is like, right, so I have to somehow create a campaign that will definitely result in these armies meeting one another,
right,
and having a big punch up, right, and also the different they all wanted to start creating their own imagination. So I had my world where there was actually started with just 2 countries, to which I then had to start adding other countries to accommodate the players, and then run probably over the course of about 6 weeks leading up to the weekend, get these people to send in their orders, and and somehow if necessary, manipulate it so that there would be. And I was mad enough to do that several times, and miraculously it always seemed to work. So if you want to set yourself a challenge as an umpire, do that where that there is going to be a weekend with, it was like 15 guys arriving, wanting to play big games over a weekend. So you have to kind of, quite a challenge. But actually, what was lovely, the first year we did it, I supplied most of my figures. Most of the figures we used almost entirely my collection of old Spencer Smith.
Oh, right. Nice.
And then after that first year, they got the bug, and so these guys started collecting their own imaginary countries and painting up some of them to the most extraordinarily beautiful standard.
That's brilliant.
So that in the latter games, we had tables carpeted with miniatures, just thousands of miniatures. And in fact, somewhere out there on YouTube, I think I put a couple of videos so people can see some of the games. And also, because of my own commitments and stuff, I couldn't go do that every year. So other people started organizing them, but also in different periods of history. So I was kind of focused on 18th century and colonials, and other people go, let's do later 19th century or pre-war, interwar, or whatever it happens to be. So that as a concept kind of mushroomed, and it was really lovely, this sense that it wasn't a normal campaign where you usually get, you've got various armies wandering around the map. Oh, we've made contact. What are we going to do? And then you have the classic campaign problem of, Right. Well, hang on. You live in Bedfordshire. I live in
Yeah,
Sussex.
yeah.
When are we going to get
I can't make Saturday. I can do the Wednesday after. And we've only got
exactly
3 hours and all that stuff.
all that coordination thing? So then you sometimes think, well, okay, it's only a little thing. So I'll tell you what, why don't you play it solo, Rob? I trust you to play it solo and come
Yeah,
back to me with the results. If necessary, you could say, all right, well, give me some basic general orders for your army, Henry, and I'll
yeah,
try to follow that. Obviously, using random dice rolls for personalities, how closely they follow the orders, all that kind of stuff. But that's the classic campaign problem, is it? So
sure.
coordinating not only the map movement and stuff, but also, wow, there's 9 of us,
But
and
then,
we
yeah,
live in all around the country.
yeah,
So actually, the weekend gig thing was ideal because basically everyone committed. Right, it's going to be that weekend, bank
yeah.
holiday weekend in May. Doesn't matter where you're coming from. We're all going to be there. Getting accommodation in local B&Bs, that kind of stuff. You're all bringing your figures, so whatever happens, there will be
Then you will
games.
be that, yeah. And
Yeah,
then you can count that back from there. You've got that. So if we start 3 months before, then you've got that
yeah,
amount of time to work. That works
exactly.
really nicely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
And
mean, it's a challenge because you do still get the, well, hang on a minute, where's he gone to? And you
oh,
discover,
of
oh,
course,
I've been working nights and I'm exhausted.
it's always going to happen. As someone who in my time has also organised musicians for a living, then herding cats is
Yes,
always the
yes.
phrase,
Wow, I
right?
was going to say, wow. Yeah, yeah.
So there's something that struck me there when you were talking earlier. Do you think campaigns is where wargaming meets RPGs?
Oh, yeah. Uh, I think so. That, I mean, obviously there are a lot of um kind of skirmish war game systems that are out there now for historical games or whatever, where certainly you can see they have been influenced by fantasy gaming and role play games,
Mm,
where it's more common now to find game systems where the personalities of the characters portrayed on the table play a role and that kind of stuff.
yeah,
But obviously, um, and my book makes it absolutely clear that there is so much stuff to be gleaned from role playing systems. Dungeons and Dragons is probably just the most famous,
sure,
where you can give your commanders characteristics, where you
yeah,
can have people's personalities really get stuck in. Um, Politics can play a part.
mm,
Uh, there's so much rich, fertile stuff to be brought across from role-playing systems that can inform and the word is enhance
I'll
your
definitely
campaigns.
enhance, because what I found is I insisted that each commander in my campaign, they have their leader, the king or queen or whatever, back at home who they're relaying messages to.
Yeah,
You've got the army commander, 2 generals, four
yeah,
captains, a magic
yeah,
user and each one has a name. And
yeah.
what I've found is then on the battlefield, they become very protective of these
Yes,
characters. Whereas
yes,
usually, oh, we just charge in, everyone dies at the end, blah, blah, blah. But
yeah,
it gives it another little nice level of
yeah,
interaction, I think. Yeah,
yeah. This is uh, a critical point. This is the difference between campaigns and one-off battles. Is that I mean, I hesitate to use the word realistic in terms of our hobby,
sure, sure.
but my preferred term is plausible. So, what happens is that the behavior of players becomes more historically plausible
Yeah.
if they're thinking, I can't just do a last ditch charge and send everyone in hell for leather. What the heck?
Mm,
I have got to think in terms of I need to keep a reserve in case it starts going wrong.
yeah.
And the troops I've sent in get beaten and start coming back. I must have some kind of reserve that I can throw in to try and stop the rot or to protect my retreat.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
can't just have my tanks running around all over the place because they're going to run out of petrol,
Well, there's that
right?
as well, the supply
You
issue,
know,
logistics.
the
Yeah, yeah.
whole supply, I'd love to say, oh, I'm sending my hussars over there, but it's barren land with nothing for them the horses to eat. So what they're going to do, end up exhausting the horses as they go across this desert, and then eat the horses, what's in your mind there? Oh no, right. So I'd better choose a route that's not just going across the middle of this bare empty desert. all that kind of stuff. And of course, yes, depending on how detailed you want to get, as you say, the political influence. I think of a famous historical campaign, and one of the greatest generals there ever was, the Duke of Marlborough, right? The stuff he had to put up with in terms of politics back home,
Right.
and the relationship between his British army and the Dutch,
Mm.
and all the complications of, back in those days, siegecraft and stuff. So battles, this is another thing, that you can bring in.
Sure.
Whereas normally people would be thinking in terms of, oh, yes, battles, battles, battles. Actually, in certain periods of history, like the early 18th century, late 17th century, sieges were the thing.
Yeah.
Battles were considered unfortunate.
Yeah.
You didn't want to risk your army in battles if you possibly could, which is why they ended up doing all these elaborate maneuvers, trying to outflank one another and try and make the enemy see that, oh, it's time to give up now, isn't it? Even though we've not shed any blood, you can see, oh, well done. Oh
Yeah.
boy, you've cut off my lines of supply there. We surrender.
We surrender.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's something to most wargamers is kind of inconceivable. What? There's been no fighting, but in a campaign context, that can make perfectly good sense. And so long as the game is structured in a way that people feel like, yes, I've actually achieved something, rather than, that was a bit boring, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, this is the nice thing with the fantasy setting, because, someone's looking for the Iron Crown, someone else is looking for the scepter or whatever. There's all these little sort of side quests, I suppose.
Yes.
And of course, if the orcs find the thing that the elves want, then there's a little bit of negotiation going on. And I'm finding that's what people are getting involved in more.
Yeah.
No one has said, "Oh, we've not had a great big battle yet." It's interesting.
Yeah, I think, and you've touched on something really important there. That of course, it's well known in a fantasy context. But bless his heart, Don Featherstone, back in the 60s, 70s, whenever it was, in his book Skirmish Wargaming, wrote stuff along those lines, saying that, well, okay, you've got, say, a group of riflemen in the peninsula, right? And each of those guys is not just a British soldier, they've got their own objectives. So you've got the one guy who's he's a bit scared, but he's a big bruise, a bit scared, but so he wants to actually stay out of the line of fire if he possibly can, and not get too involved. You've got another bloke who's basically a murderous swine who's got some sort of revenge quest against the French opposite. He's got someone else who is who basically works both sides, and so his objective is to get away just having made the most money from whoever. You've got someone else who's is determined to get promoted, because this is in the days where you had to purchase your promotions. He hasn't got enough money, so like Richard Sharp, the only way he can do it is by achieving glory and stuff. So you can bring all these little nuances in, so that each character in your force has got a different objective that may not be anything to do with winning the battle, right? That can just be, an incidental thing that arrives at the end of it, if you're lucky.
Yeah, it does add a real extra layer of interest for me, and maybe it's because my sort of mind works in that narrative fashion. I always like to build those connections and create a story, really.
Exactly.
So, final question then before we wrap up is, I mentioned earlier my Napoleonic naval battle, which took place in the Mediterranean. So I thought, we've got a lovely enclosed space. No one's going to be going this way and that way. Took quite a lot of work to set it up. I think there were 4 commanders or something like that. And the idea was they're going to scout out in the Mediterranean. Someone's going to find this, someone's going to find that, and then that sets off your battles and everything else. So one player decided he was going to put all his ships outside his port in a straight line like this on the map and just leave them there. That was it. And he complained after about turn 3. He said, well, this is a bit boring. There's nothing happening. Well, of course there's nothing happening, because you've stayed in port. Yeah, but if someone attacks the port, then I'll be ready. Yeah, but the other guy's 300 miles away, So
I love it.
And again, it created a bit of a thing at the time, and I sort of put all that stuff away and never touched it again for quite some time. But what are your tips for dealing with, shall we call them difficult players? Let's use the word difficult.
I under those kind of circumstances, well, there's a technique called fudging, basically. As an umpire, you'd like to think you can sit back and let the players do whatever they want to do. There are times when, for example, I've done exactly that, where I can see a player is doing something really strange. And so I invent a non-player character who delivers a message from the king or whatever saying, move your backside, or excuse me, sir. I mean, there's one of the campaigns, the Ayton campaigns. There was a guy who decided he wanted to build a trench system along part of the border between his country and the neighboring country.
Right.
Like anyone who knows anything about Napoleonic history, like the lines of Torres Vedras, the secret series of fortifications that Wellington built along the borders of Portugal. And so when the French turned up, what was that, 1809, they suddenly were confronted by, what the heck is all this?
Right, yeah.
And this guy, lovely guy, had this notion of doing this. And I basically had to, send a message of saying, His Majesty informs you that basically there's no budget for this, sir. Right. We have no budget for this. The spades are needed elsewhere or whatever. There was also another occasion where, this was a classic thing. Don't assume that everyone's used to map reading. And what happened was there was one guy who mistook the border line between his country and a neighboring country for a road. And he sent this brigade of cavalry along what he thought was a road. And of course, in the process, he accidentally invaded a neighboring country, a neutral country. So I was able to construct this thing from this, where basically this brigade of cavalry got stopped and strip searched by the border guards of the neighboring country, and then they confiscated the horses and sent them back home, off packing, carrying their own saddles and that kind of stuff. And that was quite amusing. So as an umpire, that's one of the challenges of being an umpire. You have to think on your feet, where you can see something happening. You don't, because the last thing you want to do is say to one of your players, oh, you're being really stupid and childish, and you're spoiling it for yourself. You don't want to do that. So you have to find a more gentle or an imaginative way, a playful way of just pointing out to them, maybe that's not the best idea. There was another one, the same campaign, funny enough, where the guy had all his spades confiscated. There was this a group of allies against another group of allies, because there were so many players, as I say, and they marched up to a border fortress in this other country, big fortress, and they had a conference, right? Okay, so we're outside this town. We've kind of we're not besieging it properly yet, but we're kind of arrayed opposite this town. So Henry, give us a hand here. So, okay, how many siege guns have we got? And I looked at their lists and I said, none. None of you remembered to bring any siege cannon. What? No, but none of you included siege cannons or siege trains in your army list. So
if you ain't written it down, you ain't got it.
You ain't got it. And so there's one person. Oh, right. Okay. Well, we're going to have to march off somewhere else. Just as a thing, Henry, just as a symbolic gesture, what we want to do, we've got batteries of ordinary artillery there. We're going to load a howitzer and just fire one shell into the city, and then march off. And as kind of a symbolic thing. And so I said, right, just one house. Okay. So there's me behind my book and everything, rolled some dice. And I looked up and I went, bang. I mean, so loud because basically this house show, they'd rolled 100 on the percentage dice, right? So the luckiest shot in Christendom, a bit like happened in the Peninsular War at a real fortress. So I adjudicated this shell had sailed over the wall and gone bounce down some steps where the magazine
Right
was,
into the
and
magazine.
someone had forgotten to lock the door, and it had gone into the magazine, exploded, and it blew up half the city. Mass casualties.
Amazing.
And so basically, suddenly these. When I said bang, it was really loud. Everyone in the room was stunned because if you've done martial arts, the ki shout, right, and it nearly floored some people, and it was hilarious because they were all like, oh my God, what's happened? And so they'd gone from being what they thought of as this nice kind of, friendly army with a just cause to suddenly being war criminals.
They've killed half the civilian population. Oh, that's amazing. But that's that plausible thing again, right? It might be extremely unlikely. It might be a 1 in 100 chance, but they got it.
Right? Yeah. And it was the fortress of Almeida, I've just remembered, that blew up in exactly that way in the Peninsular War. So that's kind of a game master's, dungeon master's, umpire's trick, which is just be sympathetic to your players because you want them to have a good time, but also don't be shy of doing something outlandish if it, because it really did. It invigorated that, that weekend, and everyone still talks about. Do you remember when Paul lobbed a howitzer shell into?
Oh, that's the nice thing. People are still talking about it years later, isn't it? That's a lovely thing. That's a lovely thing. Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Henry. I know we could go on and on just on this subject alone. There's so much there. And of course, if you want to learn more about running a campaign, well, there's the book to buy. If you want to learn more about wargaming in general, then, well, you got 2 books.
Well, I've got several books, yes.
So I can't let you go before we finish without asking you about some of your other projects as well. Podcasts, music, and painting. That's a new one for me as well. You put some lovely pictures up on Facebook the other day.
Oh yeah, well I've painted. Well, my dad, rest his soul, he was a very talented watercolor illustrator many years ago, and I suppose I just got that in my blood using watercolors. I'd always played around with them, and then at various times in my career as a designer there were opportunities to do a bit of illustration for projects, for clients, and in more recent years, like in the last 10 years, I suppose, I decided to actually try and get away from being quite so tight-arsed about being, because I was the kind of military illustrator who would do buttons on uniforms, that kind of stuff, and I wanted to start doing landscapes and stuff. And I was lucky, I'm incredibly lucky, literally in the house opposite there's an internationally renowned watercolorist called Cecil Rice lives there. And so because we have the Brighton Festival and they have open houses for the artists, so literally a few years ago, I wandered across and looked at his stuff. And was like, wow, those are watercolors. Because I think most people associate watercolor with kind of wishy-washy, pale.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be like that at all. Rich, vibrant colors and that kind of stuff. So I actually took a couple of lessons from him, learned a lot about, using it. There's a particular, this is going to sound pretentious maybe, but there's a particular technique called contre-jour, which is looking into the sunlight as a painting. Normally you're taught, you've got to have it coming over your shoulder or from the side, but no, this is used by other artists as well, like the Impressionists, where you're looking into the sun, so you've got the effect of the light on water in particular, that kind of stuff. And I'm still practicing, but I've been doing it a while now, so I'm reasonably competent, and I live in a lovely place where we've got the seafront and the pier and that kind of stuff, which makes it an ideal venue for doing that kind of painting. So and I also do abstract art as well, which is you probably haven't seen yet, Rob, which is basically using acrylics on canvas and using that again, but bold colors mixed with gold leaf as well.
That's interesting.
because I've used Goldie because I was in a medieval reenactment society where I used to do scrolls, medieval type scrolls
Oh, nice.
with
Yeah.
illumination and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the thing I do. But as I said, I had it nearly came to the point of turning it into another side hustle.
Yeah. So I heard on your latest podcast you were
Yeah, and I've
talking
just
about that.
decided,
Yeah.
but people can lead you down. Oh, if you do that, oh, can I buy one? Can I buy one? And then
Yeah. Yeah. Then
suddenly nothing.
you're setting up a website, right? You're setting
Oh,
up
and
an
all that.
Etsy
It's a lot of
and off you
hassle.
go. Yeah.
And then the people who said, "Oh, I'd buy one," they've disappeared. Because it was
Sure.
just an in the moment reaction from them. And I've decided, you know what? I think unless someone actually commissions me to do something,
Yeah.
I'm going to keep it 99% just as a hobby. And of course,
Yeah.
I've illustrated my own books,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
as well doing it. So it's useful.
Yeah, well, I think we both exist in that space where hobby and work collides, and
Yeah,
it's sometimes you just want something to take you out of both, don't you?
yeah,
But
yeah,
it is difficult to switch that. Oh, I need to be earning money to pay the bills off sometimes, whatever
yes,
you're
yeah,
doing,
yeah, yeah,
which
absolutely.
then brings on to our other shared interest, of course, which is health and fitness and martial arts and
Yeah,
well-being, which is
yeah.
something else we've spoken about together. Did you have a podcast around that as well?
Well, I did a series called Inside Your Head, which is still available on Apple Podcasts, I think, and on my own personal website, Henry Hyde Co UK. Um, and that was about mental health, psychology, wellness, all kinds of stuff. I mean, neuroscience. I
Right.
became because of my own um, brush with poor mental health. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I became very, very interested in my recovery stage of learning. Wow, how did I get into that state? How did I come to this point where my world was falling apart, as it
Mm,
and so I became very interested in how does the mind work? How does the brain work? What kind of stuff is out there to help people? So yeah, I did this series. It's like many of these things, Rob. Often you'll do something, you'll do a project that's really an opportunity for you to learn stuff.
yes.
And as I did, with my books, it's like with the campaigns book in particular, it's like, well, I know what I know, but what do other people know? And of course, when it comes to something like psychology and wellness and stuff, there's a huge wealth of stuff out there,
Yeah.
some of which, frankly, is garbage. It's got to be said. There's a lot of in inverted commas self-help, which really isn't terribly helpful. And there's a lot of people riding that wave just to make mega
Mm,
bucks,
sure.
which is a shame. But there's also some really good, useful stuff out there. So that's why I did the podcast. And each episode I interviewed someone who in some way is involved in kind of the mental health, wellness, neuroscience, that kind of thing,
Right. Right.
including a professional therapist and the head of national health nursing training and that
Oh,
kind of
wow.
stuff.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. There were some really interesting people. And that was a lot of that was being doing sort of during the COVID era, of course, which had affected the mental health of many of us. You could
well,
almost say
virtually everyone really, wasn't it?
virtually everyone
And
in the country.
still does, I think, to a large
Absolutely,
extent.
COVID
Yeah.
and the lockdown experience and stuff. So
Yeah.
yes, that was called Inside Your Head, and people can still find that out there on. I think it might be on Spotify as well, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and elsewhere.
Excellent. If I find the links, I'll put them up in the show notes below, as well as, of course, the link to your main site and your Battle Chat podcast as well,
Well,
which I
God bless you,
highly
Governor.
recommend.
There you go.
All right, lovely. Well, thanks again, Henry. It's been a fascinating chat as always, and I feel we could go on and on.
Yeah, yeah,
But
absolutely.
I hear that the dragon is stirring. He wants his lunch, I think. So if I'm not going to be the lunch, then I better sort that out now.
Well, thanks so much for having me on your show, Rob. It's been a real pleasure, and as you say, I think we're going to have each other back again on our respective podcasts because there's lots more to talk about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thanks, folks, for watching today. As always, please do send in your questions, comments, suggestions below. Always nice to get some feedback from people. Thanks to everyone who subscribed to the channel so far. If you haven't already, then please do click like, share, and subscribe and help the dragon spread its wings. We'll see you next time.